You ever just look around and wonder, what's stopping human society from completely flying apart? I mean, we build these enormous, complicated civilizations, and they always seem to be swinging back and forth between amazing cooperation and just devastating conflict. Well, let's dive into that. Because it turns out there's this hidden force, a kind of invisible regulatory system that's running the whole show.
So here's the big puzzle, right? Why this constant seesaw? You can basically read all of human history as one long story, a struggle between the forces pulling us toward chaos and the forces pulling us toward order. And that's what we're going to unpack today, the engine that's driving that struggle.
At the very heart of it all, you've got two basic states, what we'll call strain and peace. On one side, you have all the pressures, the conflict, the competition. And on the other, you have the drive for cooperation, for stability. And it's not like one is good and one is bad. Nope. They are the two poles that literally create the energy of our social lives.
And hey, this isn't some new 21st century problem. This tension, this constant tug of war between strain and peace, it's a fundamental feature of every human society that has ever existed. It's basically the default setting for civilization.
But here's a thought. What if we've been looking at all that strain the wrong way? What if it isn't just some negative thing we need to get rid of? What if it's actually the very engine that drives social change and adaptation and maybe even progress? So let's get a clear definition here. Social strain isn't just random chaos. It's the whole collection of pressures and competitive forces that create the energy a society needs to evolve. Think about it. Without that pressure, a society would just stagnate. It would become brittle and fragile. And get this idea of productive tension isn't unique to us. It's everywhere. In our own brains, it's the difference in electrical potential that lets our neurons fire and send signals. In an ecosystem, it's the competition between species that drives evolution and adaptation. And for societies, well, our disagreements are what stimulate us to change our institutions. In every case, tension isn't the problem, it's a vital part of how the system works. Okay, so if this strain is a constant and even necessary force, how do societies manage it without just blowing themselves up? Well, they develop something amazing. An invisible regulatory system, an unseen moral field that helps keep the whole thing in balance.
And we're not just talking about laws on the books or a list of commandments. No, this is something much deeper. A better way to think about it is like a magnetic field. It's this invisible but powerful force that shapes our behavior, shapes our expectations, without anyone having to stand over our shoulder and enforce it moment to moment.
And there's a name for this. We call it ethical consciousness. It's this shared, spread-out moral field that just kind of emerges from all of our collective expectations about what's fair, what's legitimate, and what preserves basic human dignity. You could almost say it's the operating software that regulates our social hardware.
So here's how all the pieces fit together. Any civilization really has three layers. You've got the form, that's the hard stuff, the structures like laws and institutions. Then you have motion, that's all the dynamic flows, like the economy, information, people moving around. But the magic layer, the one that holds it all together, is the continuum. That's ethical consciousness. It's the thing that gives legitimacy to the structures and guides the flows so they don't just spin wildly out of control.
Okay, that's enough theory for a minute. Let's shift gears and see how this actually plays out in the real world. Because history is just packed with examples where this ethical software gets a major upgrade, and it almost always happens right after a period of intense social strain.
The philosopher Peter Singer put it beautifully when he talked about the expanding moral circle. It's this simple but powerful idea that over history, the group of beings we actually think are worthy of moral consideration just keeps getting bigger and bigger. It's a pattern that shows up again and again in our ethical evolution.
And this timeline just illustrates that expansion perfectly. Look at these huge shifts, these major phase transitions. First, the Axial Age took us from just caring about our own tribe to thinking about universal principles, like compassion. Then, the Enlightenment shifted us from divine right to the idea of natural rights for individuals. And then, in the 20th century, after two brutal world wars, we got the framework of universal human rights. Each one was a radical upgrade to our collective moral code, and each one was kicked off by unbearable social strain.
And it's not random. It actually follows a pretty predictable cycle. First, social strain builds and builds until it hits a breaking point. That strain then triggers a new kind of ethical awareness, a critique of the old way of doing things. That pressure eventually forces an institutional adjustment. You get new laws, new norms. And finally, the system settles into a new, temporary state of balance. Well, until the pressure starts building all over again.
So, all of this brings us right to our doorstep today. The core argument here is that we are living right now through the early, often messy, stages of the next great ethical upgrade. And this one is happening on a planetary scale.
So why now? Well, think about it. For the first time in human history, our actions are creating unprecedented levels of planetary scale strain. Our economies, our communication systems, our environment, they're all so deeply interconnected now that no single nation can solve these problems on its own.
And this total interconnectedness is forcing us to face a whole new class of problems, right? Who's really responsible for the climate? How in the world do we govern something like AI? What do we owe to generations that aren't even born yet? Our existing ethical frameworks, which were built for tribes and for nations, are really struggling to give us good answers.
Let's bring this all home with one last, really powerful analogy. Think of a whole civilization as being like a brain. Individuals are like the neurons. Our social networks are the neural pathways connecting them. So what keeps this massive, ridiculously complex system stable and functional? Well, in the brain, it's something called regulatory integration. And in a civilization, it's ethical consciousness. It's that large-scale balancing act that keeps the entire system from having a total meltdown.
So we end on this thought. We are absolutely living in a moment of accumulating global strain. History tells us that an ethical phase transition, an upgrade, isn't just possible, it's probably inevitable. So the real question for all of us is, what will our next ethical upgrade look like, and what role are we going to play in building it?